Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of Imperial as One's Belonging series, where we explore the experiences of individuals from the Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. And this week, I say this every week, but each week we have a guest who just exemplifies something so unique within the Black or Asian or ethnic minority community, and this week is no different. We've got Anthony Reddie, who is a leading scholar in the practice of Black theology in grassroots communities and faith practices. So I'm just really happy that we've got Anthony with us, and I'm going to start off by asking Anthony if he could tell us a little bit about his early upbringing and what it was that gave him his sense of belonging, his sense of identity as he was growing up. So Anthony, welcome to Imperial as One's Belonging, and if you could let us know about what it was which gave you your initial sense of belonging and identity.
Sure, yeah, well, I think first thing to say, it's just great to be here, and it's always great to talk with fellow Black people, minority ethnic people about our experiences. I was born and brought up in Bradford, West Yorkshire, and I'm the eldest child of Noel and Lucille Reddie, and they were part of the Windrush generation, so they came from Jamaica to Britain in 1957 and 59 respectively. They didn't know each other in Jamaica. They met in a shared house in Bradford.
Right.
And I'm the eldest, and I'm the eldest of four. And I think for me, the key thing I remember growing up, and it's still a part of my identity now, was this sense of being part of a relatively small Black community in Bradford of Caribbean migrants. And there was a sense in which it seemed that nearly everybody knew everybody. So if like you were in town as a teenager, as I was, like you invariably bump into someone who would say, oh, so my name is blah, 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 blah. Tell your dad I said hi. And I was sitting there thinking, so how do you know my dad? And it's like nearly everybody seems to know everyone.
Yeah.
And one of the key things that linked this community was this thing called a partner. And so the partner was a kind of that Caribbean credit union, really. Like, so long before there were formal credit unions, these were the things that Black people used as ways of raising capital to buy larger, goods, to get deposits for houses in the days when banks didn't give loans. And my mother, she was the banker for the partner.
Right.
And so this was about 40 odd families in the partner. So over the course of a weekend, it felt like the whole of Bradford would sort of descend on our house.
Yeah.
And some people would just come in, drop their hand and leave, you know, and if I remember right, it was like £5 like per share in terms of buying your way in. And back in the day, £5 was a lot of money. You know, in terms of late 60s, early 70s, £5 was money. Yeah. And so people would come, some people would come and just drop a hand and leave. Others would come, drop a hand, but sit down and talk. Yeah. And share experiences. Some would stay for dinner. And so over the course from kind of Friday evening through to Sunday evening, people would come by. And then eventually the person who would get the sum, a part of that hand that week, would come late on a Sunday, and then my mum would hand over all the money. And she had a little notebook, and she kept these sort of meticulous records of who paid and who hadn't paid, and who owed money and who, and part of what the bank had to do was if someone hadn't paid in, then your job was to pay in for them to ensure that the person who got the pot got the full pot. Yeah. And you would then settle with the person who hadn't paid. And so there was a lot of trust involved, but obviously a huge amount of responsibility. My mum did it with, as I said, sort of meticulous records, and being right at the heart of this meant that you got to know people. So like you saw cousins, you saw extended family, you saw people who were not family, but when I was growing up, everyone who was an elder in the community, you called aunt and uncle.
Yeah.
So be auntie so-and-so, uncle so-and-so. He would never call them by the first name. That would be disrespectful. Yeah. So it was always auntie and uncle. And then eventually, like, you'd realize that some people were literally blood aunts and uncles, yeah, but others were extended family who you still called aunts and uncles. And you gave them the same respect as if they were family.
Yeah.
You know, and those values, I think, are still with me now. So I still don't call elders by their first name.
Mm-hmm.
If they're not auntie and uncle, then they're brother so-and-so or sister so-and-so.
Yeah. Or
they're Mr. so-and-so, but they're never first name, because as my mother used to always say, that me and you are not size. You know, like, so me and you are not equals, you know. And that, I think, is important. So it doesn't matter how many qualifications I have or what the work I've done. My dad is still my dad.
Mm-hmm.
He's never Noel. It's never a first name in formality. He will always be my father and always be older than me, and therefore accorded a certain amount of respect. Yeah. And those values are still important to me in terms of the work I do now.
So you've highlighted the fact that you growing up. I love the story of the partner. I understand that the element of trust, and your mum being, it's one thing being someone who's just adding a hand to the partner, but being the banker, you know, yeah, that's a big responsibility, right? I want to say, enough man dead for less than that, you know.
Yeah,
because,
exactly.
You know,
exactly.
So when you look at it like that, you think to yourself, and you growing up around that in a small, tight-knit Black community, how was that then in terms of then, when I think of Bradford and I think of working class white population, etc., how was that then different in terms of you going out into the actual Bradford community at large, and the kind of things that you experienced then?
Yeah. Well, I mean, not that I knew it at the time, but looking back, I think what I developed are the classic skills of being able to analyze the world and being able to decipher it for its truth. And what I mean by that is that when you're a child of migrants, particularly if you're the eldest child, as in my case, that you are naturally always experimenting. So, for example, when I went to school, I was the first person in my family to go to school in this country, because my parents got to school in Jamaica, and therefore education was entirely a different phenomenon in that island compared to the UK. And because the world in which I grew up in was essentially a diasporan world of Caribbean culture, so my parents did what all classic migrants do, which is like you try to recreate home away from home. So at home, you know, we ate Jamaican food, you know. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what we ate all the time, because that's what my parents had. And you would relate to your family as if we were still back in the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, as when you go out into the wider world, and this is predominantly white working class Bradford, you realize that this is a different world. These are different values. People speak to each other differently. I still remember sitting with a white friend and going past his house. And as he was the same age as me, he was about 10, 11. And as he was coming out, he was having an argument with his mother. And he told his mother to F off. F off. And I'm thinking, what? How? Because trust me, if I had tried that, I would not be alive now. You know, I mean, there would be an unmarked grave somewhere, you know, like with a little stick in it. And that's where Anthony Reddie was, because he was two-faced. You know what I mean? So, you know, I mean, and so immediately I was aware that there were different set of values here in this outer world. And the thing you then learn is how you navigate going from one to the other. And so one of the interesting thing is that in kind of Black studies is the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois in his book called The Souls of Black Folk talks about double consciousness, you know, this twin vision of, on the one hand, the inner world of Black self-determination, this sense that we know that we're important because we're human beings, we have culture, we have traditions, and yet the wider world of white supremacy that reduces us to objects and tells us that we're nothing. And Du Bois saw this as this struggle that at its worst led to a kind of sort of psychological sense of, I guess, of negation in terms of how you struggle those two elements. And at its worst, it does lead to increased levels of mental ill health amongst Black folk. I mean, we are more disposed to schizophrenia within this particular culture than almost any other, I guess, ethnic or racial group. But at its best, what I think double consciousness gives you is a two vision of being able to see the world, your world, and see the other world, and to be able to interpret what other people are doing. So one of the things I learned very quickly when I was growing up in Bradford is that I knew far more about white people than they ever knew about me. I knew their world because I lived in it, I had to engage with it, but they knew nothing about my world. And that I still remember gave me a certain amount of power, because if I kept quiet about what my world was, then they knew nothing about it. And therefore, by not revealing it, that gave me a certain level of confidence and power. So one of the things I remember with some of my Black friends was that although we were prohibited from speaking Patois at home because of my parents did not feel proud about it, they felt it was kind of corrupt working class speech, and we should always speak proper Queen's English and be properly good manners, and and to engage with white culture. Part of our power when we were Black kids, before the white kids caught on, of course, was that we could speak in Patois and they did not know what we were talking about. Yeah. It was our kind of secret code. It was our secret way of communicating with each other, because it was part of our inner world that they didn't know about. And so I think that sense of being able to kind of decode what's going on is something I think every Black person instinctively learns, that we're probably not even aware of. But every time I go into a new social situation, I'm looking at the room, I'm looking at not what is just said, but what is not said. So what are the unspoken rules that are taking place in this particular context? And that's something I've done ever since I was a kid. And I think that's part of how you navigate your way into the wider world, is by being able to analyze it, to reflect on it, to work out the spaces where you feel safe and where you can speak truth. Yeah. And the places where things do not feel safe and you learn a code, you learn to signify. I think signification is one of the big things that Black communities do. We have layers of speech. Yeah. And as one of the things I learned, again, from my parents and the elders, was that if you ask them a story for why something had happened, they could give you about half a dozen different versions of that same story. And depend upon how old you were when you asked them, and depend upon what mood they were in, they could give you one of a variety of stories. And you soon realize that the truth was this complex amalgam of all those different versions, but you rarely found out what the definitive version was. And that, I think, is part of what has enabled us to survive slavery and colonialism, is that when you're dealing with white power, you never tell them the whole truth, because that's only going to get you into trouble, or they will have some mastery over you. So one of the things you learn is to speak in code, and you give them different versions of, I mean, so I've sat and watched my mother speak to a white person and say that she's never faced racism in Britain. She says, "Oh, I've never faced racism in Britain. Britain's such a wonderful place." And you notice a lie, you think, that's not true. That's not what you've told me. But here's the thing. She knows that's what that white person wants to hear at that moment. So let me tell them what they want to hear in order that this conversation doesn't have to get into some deep issues, which are going to end up militating against me. Yeah. So let me tell them what they want to hear. Yeah. So they will go away and say, well, actually, Mrs. Reddie is so loves Britain. I mean, she's never faced racism. Well, no, actually, that's not the whole truth. It's the truth I'm prepared to tell you now, in order to try and make a way in a society that has not been created with me in mind.
I'm loving this, right? Because the philosophical debate which is going on in my mind as I'm listening to the kind of like the bicultural competencies which you've developed, the code switching which enables you to be able to navigate the space which we find ourselves. Where did that all develop in you? Where was there a clinch point, a point where you thought to you kind of like recognized that I have to act like this in order to make my way through, otherwise I'm not going to be able to get to where I hope to get to eventually? Was there a point in time where that happened?
Yeah. Well, for me, I mean, it was a really dramatic moment, and it's something I've reflected on a lot and written about quite a lot. So it was literally my first day at school.
Right.
And so my first day at school was at a place called Usher Street Primary School. I was the only, inverted commas, coloured boy, as we were called in those days, late 60s. And at the time, Bradford was one of those places that was part of an educational cultural experiment where they had what were called, what are they called now? They were, sorry, it's just got out of my head that my brain has gone to mush due to post-COVID. I apologize.
No, that's right.
Yeah, so they're called immigration centres. Sorry,
right.
That's what I was looking for. Yeah. So the immigration centres, and they were set up on the back of Section 11 of the 1966 Local Government Act. So those areas are what's called high density, which meant areas that had absorbed a large amount of migrants from the Caribbean and from South Asia. The big issue was, well, how then do we socialize these foreigners into a British way of life? And so they set up these things called immigration centres that would take children of Caribbean and Asian background, Asian families, and send them into an immigration centre. And the idea was that like you would be socialised into there. So you probably maybe spend a term there, maybe 2 terms.
Right.
And then after that, you'd then be integrated into the formal state system.
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. I was born in Bradford.
Yeah.
And my parents come from the Caribbean, from the island of Jamaica, that was colonized by the British, and they speak English. At no point did anyone sit down and say, well, I'll look at this kid and ask him where he comes from and how he understands himself. No one did that. All they saw was a black kid turns up and they marched me off to the immigration center because, remember, I'm the eldest child of migrants. My parents don't know any better, so they assume that every child gets sent to the immigration center.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so for about 3 or 4 days, I'm in this immigration center. And I mean, truth is, I was only 4 years old. So I have really no memories of it. I've kind of built a kind of revisionist version of it.
Yeah.
For the sake of teaching and analysis. And of course, that has become much more comedic over the years. And so the truth is, a lot of it is kind of mentioned because I don't really remember what happened.
Yeah.
But I do have very vague memories of thinking that this school thing must be quite easy because you're largely asking me questions to which I know the answers already. So they were trying to work out how good my English was. Yeah. I remember my parents are Jamaican who speak English, and I was born in Bradford.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the fact that I've got a thick Bradfordian accent in no way tips them off that maybe I might kind of be British rather than having come from some place in darkest Africa. Not that there's anything wrong with any of that, you understand, but in their imagination, I'm this other. And at no point does it ever occur to them that actually being a product of British colonialism, I'm more English than they are. You know, I mean, in terms of my parents going to an island where they used pounds, shilling and pence before independence, and shops closed half day on a Wednesday kind of thing, you know. That's how English work. But of course, like, the British did not know anything about these creatures they had created through the prism of colonialism. And so once I was back in the school, I remember, I think it was like my second or third day, and I remember sitting, and again, it's a story I've been told that has become humorous over the years. So our first school dinner is a bowl of soup.
Okay.
Tomato soup.
Okay.
And as far as I'm concerned, this is soup. This is just a plate full of orange, dirty water, basically. Like, it don't look like soup to me. Like, soup is a bowl with things in it, you know, like with yam and banana and dasheen and bones and meat and dumplings. That's what soup is. This ain't soup. So I'm sitting there looking at this bowl full of water, and I put my hand up. Remember, like the only coloured boy in the class in the whole school. And the teacher comes to me and says, "Anthony, what's up?" And I said, "Miss, what is this?" And she said, "It's soup. This is what we eat, soup." And I said, "No, miss, this is not soup." And she said, "How do you mean?" And anyway, so I'm trying to explain what soup is. And I thought like she's found this highly amusing because like she hasn't got a clue what I'm talking about. And the more I'm trying to explain is the funnier it gets to the teachers, all the white kids who were thinking, who's this crazy boy explaining this concept of soup that doesn't accord with what we think soup? The soup is here, you know, it's liquid, there's nothing in it, and it's watery. And I'm thinking to myself, well, soup is like some stew thing with things in it and bones and whatever, and it's a big plate, and it takes, first that takes hours to cook and takes a long time to get through it. It's a hearty meal. Anyway, so when I get home now, and I explained to my mum how embarrassing it was, because I'm trying to explain what soup is, and my mum sat me down and says, "Anthony, the next time they ask you or you encounter what they are doing, you just go along with it. If they ask you what you eat at home, you tell them that you eat roast beef and Yorkshire pudding." Now, here's the thing. In all my years living at home, I never ate roast beef and Yorkshire pudding once, never. But what she said was that actually, in order to survive in their context, you tell them what they want to hear. And that was a lot of time I brought up questions of soup or what this food looks like, because I knew that back home we ate something different. But at that point, there wasn't the cross-cultural kind of understanding. But now, now Caribbean foods it's vogue. Everyone talks about jerk and talks about pancake and talks about plantain. But in those days, remember, late 60s, early 70s, it was still a novelty. It was still unknown to most white people. And so this thing about assimilation, this thing about learning to fit in and to go along with what is the general norm, which doesn't mean that you forgot what your home and indigenous culture was. It's just that you learned very quickly that in order to survive, certainly in the North, I mean, it may have been different for Black kids growing up in London, but certainly growing up in Bradford, where it was a very small community, there was this very clear divide between what you do within the confines of your home and the extended community, and what you do in the work in the outer world. So my mom always had a saying, which is that like you have to learn to dance at home before you dance abroad.
So that's an early, the depiction which you've just said is a very early realization or lesson of how it was perceived that we have to navigate this space which we were occupying as immigrants in this country. I want to kind of like move on to the idea of, because you're also a professor of theology. So how did religion and that play out within the community as you were growing up, and how did that lead to where you are now?
So one of the clear things that I think struck me as a kid, and actually it's one of the things that has remained with me ever since I was about 5 or 6, and now I'm 57. There's been this unchanging relationship in terms of faith, which was that there were 2 dimensions to it. Externally, Christianity was undoubtedly, in terms of how it was passed on to me, very much a handmaiden of white supremacy. So I remember going to the church that we grew up in was a predominantly white Methodist church. So I'm still a Methodist now. And I remember, and again, it's something I've read about. So one of the things I do a lot in my work is I use my own existential experiences as ways of theologizing and theorizing, rather than start with abstract theories. I start with real stories and real experiences and then move out from them in a much more kind of inductive way. So I remember being about 11 and 12 and sitting in one of our Sunday school rooms
Mhm.
And there was a picture of a white Jesus.
Yeah.
And the joke I often say to students is, although it doesn't work now with the younger generation of students, I used to say that this Jesus looked more like Bjorn Borg than Bjorn Borg looks like Bjorn Borg.
Yeah.
That doesn't work with teenagers these years, because I did a few. I did that a few months ago in the class I was teaching in Oxford, and all the students looked at me and said, "But who's Bjorn Borg?" I'm like, "Oh." Okay, forget that. But anyway, this was a very blue-eyed, blonde-haired Jesus.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm looking at this picture and I'm thinking to myself, this guy has nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with me. So how can he save my soul when he looks like all the other people in the city and the broader, I said broader world, but at that point, I've probably not even left Bradford that often, really. But certainly he represented people who had power and authority and did not look like anyone in my community, the people who loved and supported. And so immediately that created within me a kind of dialectic, I guess, really, is this struggle between, so on the one hand, I'm being brought up to believe in God who's revealed in Jesus Christ, and yet the Jesus Christ that I'm being taught about and that is confronting me looks very much like the power structures of a city that is deeply racist.
Yeah.
Now, balance that with the faith of my parents, particularly my mother. And her version of Christianity wasn't particularly radical at the time, although looking back, it really was very implicitly radical, which was that even if white people say Jesus looked like this picture on the wall, the God who was alongside us in our everyday struggles was one who knew us and loved us and was on the side of those who were marginalized and the side of people who were nobodies or considered to be nobodies, but was not on the side of those who represented power and authority and empire and the status quo. So although no one in my community would have said explicitly that God was black, there was no doubt in my mind that the God who was prayed to by my family and our extended family was one who understood us.
Yeah.
And therefore God understood us, then God then could not look like that person in the picture, because that person in the picture did not understand us. That white people didn't know anything about. They didn't know anything about our lives, about our secret struggles, our ambitions. I mean, so for example, when I was growing up, certainly up until my middle teens, when we spoke about home wasn't Bradford. Home was back in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
Home was this mythologized place that I didn't visit until I was 17 years old. You know, I mean, I didn't go to Jamaica for the first time until I was doing my A-levels. And that's the first time I met my grandmother, my aunts and uncles, met lots of cousins I heard about for years in terms of growing up with the mythology of back home.
Yeah.
Now, white people didn't know anything about the fact that we had this complex dialectic about what home was. Home wasn't the place you're living in. Place is some other place that you have these memories of that are constructed, that is idealized, is romanticized. It's not as people had imagined or spoken about it, because to be brutal, if it'd been that brilliant, then like you wouldn't have left it in the first place, you know, like you left it because you were poor and because you were struggling and you were trying to make a new life. So there are all kinds of complex issues that were going on in how Black people spoke about ourselves and how we understood ourselves, that religion in general and Christianity in particular was a helpful way of navigating that. But that had very little to do with the formal religion that was taught in churches, particularly by white authorities. So that dichotomy is one that I carried with me right into my early 20s. So when I studied at university, I did mainly church history. And that was largely a very Eurocentric course. The only bit we did that began to get me to think about this divide and how you might bring it together was that we had a course on the civil rights. And so we looked at Martin Luther King and we looked at the history of the civil rights in America. interesting enough, no one ever talks about a civil rights movement that existed in Britain.
Yeah.
That although not as famous, was still significant in terms of bus boycott in Bristol, in terms of boycott of shops that happened in London and happened in various other parts of the country. So interesting enough, no one ever talks about civil rights movement in Britain, but we quickly look to America. But even so, these are still Black people, and I'm still identified with Martin Luther King. And therefore, listen to his sermons. His version of Christianity then sounded like the version that I was hearing from my mother and from my extended family, but not from the version I was hearing from school, and certainly not from the one I was hearing from church in terms of the official version. And really, it was the attempt to learn more about this other informal understanding of it that then got me into Black theology. And that's where the interest in Black theology came from, because I then wanted to understand in more formal terms what this expression of religion is that is anti-hegemonic. It is very much linked to struggle and liberation. It's linked to a fight for rights. It's a belief in an alternative worldview. So I remember reading, one of the early things I read was Korn's first book, Black Theology and Black Power, where Korn looks at the Black Power movement and says, actually, this movement is more Christian than most white people who go to church and still support segregation and lynching. Why? Because actually, Jesus himself was a colonized Jew. So the fact that he himself was someone of color who lived in a colonized context, oppressed by imperialism, makes his experience more analogous to us as Black people than it does to white people with power. That was one of my early kind of light bulb moments when something went up in my head. And I thought, you know something? I have probably been exposed to a version of Black theology without knowing it for many years, because one of the things that one of my uncles would say is he would say, sometimes when we would sit down in the house, so again, when he'd come around to drop the partner, we would sit down, and he was a bit of a kind of armchair sort of philosopher. So every family has the one guy who's read some book and has all these crazy theories that you thought were crazy at the time. But looking back, they weren't crazy at all, you know? I mean, I remember him sitting down and saying, you know, he said, these white people think that they're going to go to heaven, but like a lot of them are going to go to hell. A lot of them are going to go to hell because they don't know nothing about God. God is someone who's on the side of African peoples. Now, I've never heard any Black person say this outright, and my mum would say, "Oh, be quiet, just be quiet with all your politics." But looking back, he was Afrocentric. He was a Garveyite. He was someone whose own father had been part of the Garvey movement in the 20s and 30s. And so he was born because my uncle was born in 1930. And so he would have been on the back end of that. And so he carried through some of these ideas. And although he worked in a factory, he worked with his hands, and he wasn't schooled in the traditional sense. He just had this natural sense of justice for Black people. And so he would sit down and he would pontificate and talk his stuff, which at the time, as I said, when I was growing up in Bradford, where for the most part, as I said, we were taught to not to challenge authority, but to assimilate, keep your head down, try to pretend to be white to get along. When my uncle's sitting there talking about white people are going to go to hell because they're white, and God loves Black people, and God loves Africa, and Africa's a blessed land. I'd never heard any Black person speak like this before, and I'm thinking to myself, oh, he's either a genius or he's mad, or he's both. You know, but and I think some of those conversations again stayed with me. So then when I began to study at university, but particularly just after university, before I started my doctorate, it was this sudden realization that actually a lot of what he's saying was not crazy at all. It was actually written down in books by the likes of Marcus Garvey, by the likes of Malcolm X, by the likes of Kwame Nkrumah, and various other people who were part of the sort of decolonizing kind of process. And people who I now teach, I realize that my introduction to them, not necessarily in terms of their names, but in terms of some of those ideas, came from some of the elders who would speak in very, very unguarded ways, sat around our table when they were dropping the pad.
Let me just ask, I'm just wary of time, and I don't really want to slow this conversation down, but I'm just wary of the time. And one of the things which, as you've been discussing, which has been flying in my head, is about how the black theology has impacted on your sense of belonging, your sense of identity. How do the two marry up and kind of like combine for your thirst for the discovery of the black theological practice?
So one of the things, again, about growing up in the household I did was this other interesting tension between my mum, who was very Christian, very pietistic, but not overtly political. So as I said, so her view was that Jesus was on our side. Jesus would help us to survive and to make a way out of nowhere, and just to find a way of navigating our world and navigating ourselves in the white world without ever challenging that world. Now, my dad, when I was growing up, he went to church occasionally, but it wasn't a particularly strong church goer. I mean, he is now in his elder age, but certainly when we were growing up, not so much. But he was very political. And so he was a strong trade unionist. He was very active in his trade union work. And so I named, so my two names are Anthony George Reddie. Anthony comes from Tony Benn. So Tony Benn, that was one of my dad's heroes. So my dad was on the left, trade unionist. So Tony Benn, he respected Ben. And George comes from one of my grandparents, who were called George Marriott, who was a kind of autodidact, a black guy from an enslaved background who learned to read and was a very prominent leader within black communities in Portland. But growing up, there was a clear divide. So Christianity empowered me, but was non-political, was apolitical, had nothing to say about social issues. And then for my dad, I got the clear sense of the importance of collective work, working together, challenging authority through union work. And so all my aunts and so all my uncles, all of them worked in factories. They were all in the trade union. They're all I think sort of trade unionists, and implicitly political in terms of being allied to a Labour Party that was still racist, but just in their mind not as bad as being conservatives. What I got from black theology when I then got into my 20s was a way of marrying those two things, a way of having a faith that was both pietistic and spiritual, that was very much internal, that empowered you, but also was involved in activism and challenging openly white supremacy, discrimination, prejudice, and systemic racism. And so what I then got really from black theology was a way of holding these two things together, that activism and trying to change the world was a central part of Christianity, as it was in terms of a spiritual change within an individual that enables them to live a more holy life and to be in tune with God. That those two things were not in opposition, they were fundamentally linked. And what I gained from black theology was an understanding that the historical Jesus, who, as I said, a colonized Jew in a colonized nation that is overpowered by the Roman Empire, that his experiences in his context therefore means that he is analogous to and is responding to people whose experiences are not that dissimilar in 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st century context. And so the God that is revealed in Jesus Christ in Black liberation theology is one who is always on the side of the marginalized and the oppressed, and is speaking truth to power. Or more accurately, what I would say in terms of James Cone, my hero, who's the He's the architect of Black liberation theology, speaking Black truth to white power.
Right, right. I'm just wary of the time. We're going to go over, but I'm going to just quickly open up to see if there's anyone in the audience with us who has got a question that they would like to ask you. Otherwise, I still have at least one more question which I would like to get through. If there's anyone in the audience who'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm going to, in view of time, just go on. Okay. I'm going to ask, and I don't want it to be my final question, but it might well be my final question. Yeah. Based on what you've told me in terms of, or what you've told us in terms of the Black theologian and the practical Christianity, the justice-seeking Christianity which you see within the Black theologian narrative, what advice would you have given to your younger self in terms of your development and how they would get to the stage where you're at now? What key bit of advice would you say would have been useful for you?
I would say not to feel embarrassed about yourself and not to be afraid to speak your truth. I mean, I think whilst I got what my parents were saying about learning to assimilate and learning to fit in, that what that did mean nonetheless was a certain reticence about being honest about who one is, and a certain embarrassment about Black culture and Black traditions, because I think there's a thin line between trying to fit in, which I get, and therefore fitting in because you think that white norms are superior and they're a better expression of what it is to be a human being than the things that you've grown up with within your own household. And so I felt, for a long time, I felt acutely embarrassed about some of the cultures and traditions I was a part of. And so certainly now speaking to someone now who just loves being Black, I mean, I can't imagine growing up not being Black, I mean, to be honest with you, I find the presumption of white superiority a joke, because we know everything about popular culture is dominated by Black people. We know that we are the trendsetters, we are the ones that have the cultural barometer. So, so it's always interesting when people say, so what is the new Black? Well, actually, there's no new Black. Black is Black,
Yeah.
And so I'm proud. I love the culture and traditions in all its varied forms that have helped to shape not just who we are, but let's be honest with you, has helped to determine style across the whole world.
Yeah.
I wish I had learned that when I was younger. I wish I had felt more confident about articulating the things that were important to me because they were part of who I am. And certainly now, if I was talking to my younger self, I would say, Anthony, don't feel the need to pretend to be something in front of your white friends, because secretly they want to be more like you than you want to be like them. So just stand up, speak your truth. And if they like it, they like it. If they don't like it, then so what? That's their loss. That's not your loss.
Fantastic. I do want to have just one last question. Right?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Right,
I mean, I've got time.
Right, I've got one last question. And I say, of all of this kind of like work which you've done in uncovering and developing the narrative, what would be your biggest, to date, what would be your biggest achievement that you would like to highlight and let people know about?
Sure. Yeah, okay. So I've written and edited, the next book will be my 21st. So, I mean, I don't like to show off, it's just that, I love writing. So, Yeah, so the next book will be 21st. I think it's not my best book by any means, but my favorite book, only because I just remember the research to put it together, was one of my earliest ones. So it was called Faith, Stories, and the Experience of Black Elders. Faith, Stories and the Experience of Black Elders, published by a small publisher in London called Jessica Kingsley, came out in 2001. I think it was in print up to a couple of years ago. And the reason why I love that book is it was my attempt to theologize on the Windrush generation. And so in terms of doing the research, I just went around as many of the Black elders I knew in Birmingham and Bradford and London, predominantly older women. And I sat down and I put a tape recorder in front of them and I said, just tell me your story. Just tell me how you have survived from coming from the Caribbean to Britain, coming through racism, coming through the whole era of no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, And they told me stories. Now, one of the early things I learned as a researcher is, do not turn off the microphone. All the best bits came once I switched the off button off. And then it's like, oh my God. So now you're telling me this story. And we howled with laughter, the jokes, because I think one of the things I love about Black people is our sense of humor. It's our sense of being able to laugh at the absurd. And some of the stories I heard were just life-giving, just absolutely life-giving. And so that's my favorite book. Not because I did a great job at it, actually, it was a very early book. And if I were writing it now, it would be 3 times the size. I would have kept in more of the kind of subversive and transgressive stories because I was trying to write a very Christian book. I was working in a Bible college at the time.
Yeah.
I guess that some of the stories are a bit more on the edge. I kind of put out, which I shouldn't have done, because actually that's part of who we are. As Black people, we merge the sacred and the secular. There's not this clear divide. There's this overlap between the two, and some of the ways in which the use of humor and the use of narrative to explain who we are. That's my favorite book. And I dedicated that book to my parents. And I dedicate it to everybody in that Windrush generation because they have paved the way. That I still say that when we talk about Great Britain, the great in the Great Britain has been provided, not by empire imperialism, it's been provided by Black people of the Windrush generation who have shown what real fortitude and generosity and love and community looks like, because their ability to work together, to have a sense of unity that enable people like me to flourish is something that I think that we need to cherish and hold on to.
I'm going to challenge you then, because you said that there was a lot of narratives which you kind of like left out. Maybe you need to do faith stories and the part 2, you know, where you
I probably do.
I
probably do need to do a part 2. So I'll tell you a really quick one, which I thought was so funny. So there's one woman who said that, like, she was talking about, and for the fact she was sat in the room with her grown-up children. So these are people who were kind of my age now. So that at the time they'd be in their late 30s, early 40s, and she was in their 60s. And she, of course, being a woman of a certain age, would say, well, you know, I mean, I brought my children up, I tried to give them strong Caribbean values. I was very open with my children and I know that's not true. And her and her son sat next to her and looks at me and then looks at his mum and said, but mummy, that's not true. She said, I mean, he says, well, you know, she said, like, you used to beat me when I was a kid. She said, oh, I never did that. She said, anyway, so he tells a story. He said, Anthony says, we had a black dog called Satan. I thought, who calls a dog Satan? Because, oh yeah, because he was a fierce dog called Satan. And basically, he said, every time I was in trouble, like, my mum would back me up, and she would say, okay, now what did you do wrong? And I would lie. All kids lie. Like, she would whistle, and Satan would go out the room, and Satan would come back with the belt in his mouth. So basically, like, so essentially, like, she trained the dog to come in with the belt, and then so Satan would come and sit next to him with the belt in his mouth, right? And then the mother would say to the son, okay, so like, I'm going to ask you that story again. And this time I want the truth, because if I don't get the truth, like Satan that is waiting for you, Satan will be there with the belt in his mouth. And he would then say, at which point he then had to decide, okay, so do I try to style it out and come up with the same story, even though I know it's a lie, my mother knows it's a lie, and Satan knows it's a lie as well? Or do I then confess? In which case he said, I'm going to get beaten anyway. It's a question of what am I going to get the beating for? I'm going to get the beating for because I'm trying to hold on to the lie. I'm going to get the beating because I'm going to tell the truth.
Yeah.
But having told the lie in the first place, I'm still going to get the beating.
That's right.
Now at this point, all of us are laughing our heads off. I mean, this is hilarious stuff. But of course, like the tape recorder switched off.
Yeah. That's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. You know what? Before the elders within our generation are passing on, we need to put together a homage for them and go back and revisit those stories before those stories and the younger generation don't get to actually hear about the pioneers who came here from the Caribbean. So I think that's something that I would look forward to, and if I can help in any way, I would love to be able to. But Anthony, it's been absolutely brilliant having you on this afternoon, and thank you for being so candid and open with your discussion of your experiences of gaining belonging. I think we've only just scratched the surface, but I'd love to be able to sit down and reason together, because I think it was absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you once again. I'm going to just share what's going to be on next week, or not next week, the week after next. In a couple weeks' time, we're going to have Dr. Mark Richards, who's a principal teaching fellow in the Faculty of Engineering, Faculty of Natural Sciences at Imperial College, and he's going to give us. He's DJ. He's so much. He's a physicist, a chemist, so many things which he's done. So it'll be a really fascinating story on the Friday, the 22nd of April. And if you've missed any of the other Belonging episodes, then please go to our YouTube channel at tinyurl.com/belonging-IAO, where you'll be able to see this and other videos of our interviews with our guests. So until a couple of weeks' time, have a good Easter break, and I will see you again in 2 weeks. So thanks very much.